He grew up far from the sea, but it was the only place he ever truly belonged. Richard Hetherington O'Kane was born on February 2nd, 1911, in Dover, New Hampshire, a quiet mill town with more smoke than salt in the air. His father taught at a local school. His mother kept the family steady through the hard years of the Depression. Nothing in his early life hinted that he would one day command the most feared submarine in the Pacific. But from an early age, O'Kane was drawn to precision, to rules that made sense in a world that rarely did. He was not loud, nor particularly tall or imposing. He was methodical, with a sharp mind and a quiet confidence that made people trust him. At the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, he was not among the charismatic stars who commanded attention in the mess hall. He preferred the engineering rooms, the places where things worked, because someone cared enough to make them work. Classmates remembered him as steady as a compass. That steadiness would one day save his life. Graduating in 1934, he entered a navy still in transition, small, cautious, clinging to old traditions. Submarines were not yet romantic. They were cramped, experimental, and dangerous. To most officers they were a dead end. To O'Kane, they were a challenge, a place where precision and nerve mattered more than politics. Underwater, he once said, there's no rank, only responsibility. His first years were spent learning the language of the deep, pressure, ballast, the slow pulse of machinery. He served on USS Argonaut and USS R-13, where life was less about combat and more about discipline. Days blended together, drills, maintenance, endless checklists. But for O'Kane, this monotony was comforting. He found beauty in the rhythm of valves opening, in the hum of engines as the submarine sank below the surface and the outside world disappeared. He read voraciously, not novels but manuals, diagrams and reports from the few officers who had dared to dream of true submarine warfare. He understood before most that this new kind of battle would not be won by size or speed, but by silence, patience and precision. When war came to America in December 1941, O'Kane was ready. Pearl Harbor was a wound that cut deep through the Navy, but for men like him, it also meant purpose. The oceans were now divided into predators and prey, and he intended to make sure the US Navy learned how to hunt. In early 1942, he was assigned to USS Wahoo as executive officer under Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, a bold, unpredictable captain who believed submarines should attack like wolves, not shadows. Where Morton was fire, O'Kane was ice. The two men formed one of the most effective duos in submarine history. Morton trusted O'Kane completely, calling him the nerve center of the boat. On Wahoo, he learned what leadership looked like under pressure. Not speeches, but gestures, a nod, a whisper, a calm tone during the countdown before firing. He also saw what courage cost. The Pacific was vast, and most patrols ended in silence. Weeks of waiting for a single target, then moments of violence so sudden they felt unreal. In his letters home, he rarely mentioned fear. Instead, he wrote about process. Torpedo malfunctions, depth calculations, sonar range limits. But between the technical lines, there was an undertone of awe. You never really see your enemy, he once noted. Only their lights, their wakes, and the sound of them dying. By 1943, he had become known among his peers as a man who could think faster than the sea. Morton said it best. O'Kane's brain works like a periscope, always scanning, always focused. Yet even then O'Kane was restless. He respected Morton but disagreed with his recklessness. Aggression without calculation, he believed, was suicide disguised as bravery. The lessons were hard and they came fast. In January 1943, during a patrol in the Sea of Japan, Wahoo slipped through minefields and torpedoed several Japanese ships at point-blank range. The danger thrilled Morton. It terrified O'Kane, not for his life, but for his crew. Luck, he said later, is not a strategy. That patrol ended with both triumph and foreboding. Wahoo became famous for its daring attacks, but fame is a heavy burden in war. Later that year, when Wahoo disappeared, lost with all hands, O'Kane was not aboard. He had already been reassigned to take command of his own boat, the USS Tang. He never forgot that twist of fate. "Every submarine captain lives on borrowed time," he wrote later. "Mine was borrowed from Wahoo." The quiet officer from New Hampshire was now stepping into command, the next phase of the silent war beneath the Pacific. He would lead differently from Morton, less fire, more control, yet fate, patient and precise, was already plotting its own ambush. He was about to become the deadliest submarine commander in the Pacific, and the ocean he ruled would one day turn against him. He learned the art of hunting in the silence between heartbeats. When Richard O'Kane joined USS Wahoo in early 1942, the American submarine force was still learning how to fight. The boats were new, the crews green, and the torpedoes unreliable. The Pacific was immense and merciless, an empty world of blue where the hunter was often the hunted. O'Kane's first months under Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton would shape everything that followed: his patience, his tactics, and his belief that the ocean rewards only those who listen. Wahoo was different from most submarines. Morton believed in taking the war to the enemy, fast, aggressive, and close. His style broke every rule the Navy had written about submarine warfare. He would surface in daylight to attack convoys, fire at ranges so short that the shockwave could rattle the boat itself, and shout encouragement over the intercom as if leading a cavalry charge. O'Kane stood behind him in the conning tower, quiet, watching. Where Morton was instinct, O'Kane was calculation. Their partnership worked because it balanced chaos with order. O'Kane tracked bearings and plotted intercepts with mathematical precision, while Morton trusted his instincts for timing. The results were staggering. On a single patrol in January 1943, Wahoo sank 8 enemy ships, a record at the time. Each success was a combination of Morton's daring and O'Kane's precision. "We fought like one brain with 2 temperaments," he later said. But victories came with lessons written in fire. O'Kane saw how easily one mistake could erase an entire crew. He watched as torpedoes malfunctioned, veering back toward their own wake. He saw radar fail, batteries die, and nerves collapse in the dark. In one attack, after missing a target, Morton swore and ordered the periscope raised again, exposing them to depth charges. O'Kane said nothing, but later wrote, "A good submarine officer must have the courage to wait. Patience saves lives. Anger only stirs the water." Every dive on Wahoo was a test of endurance. When the order came, "Dive! Dive!" the air filled with the hiss of compressed tanks, the red glow of battle lights, and the metallic groan of the hull descending into blackness. The crew counted the seconds by instinct, waiting for the depth gauge to settle. Then came silence, the kind that could drive men mad. O'Kane learned to measure time by sound: the slow heartbeat of the engines, the ticking of the clock, the creak of steel expanding under pressure. At night, when the submarine surfaced to recharge batteries, he would stand on the bridge, breathing the cold Pacific air, watching phosphorescent waves break around the bow. Above him stretched the Milky Way, a reminder that the world was vast and impersonal. "You never feel smaller," he wrote, "than when you're the only noise on a quiet ocean." In those moments, O'Kane began to see the submarine not as a weapon, but as an instrument of will, a tool that magnified the discipline of its commander. He studied every mechanical detail: gyro compass drift, periscope optics, engine vibration. He spoke to the crew with calm authority, never raising his voice. To them, he was not a fiery leader like Morton. He was a steady hand, the kind of officer who would calculate rather than hope. His professionalism earned him respect even from men who craved Morton's fire. "If Mush was our spirit," one sailor said, "Mr. O'Kane was our brain." But O'Kane also knew that professionalism alone could not win the war. The Japanese Navy was efficient, determined, and ruthless. Their escorts hunted submarines with depth charges that could crush a hull in seconds. Every attack was a gamble, every dive a prayer. "You can't see your enemy," he said later, "only feel him closing in." By mid-1943 he was ready for command, though he didn't know it yet. When Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor, its reputation was legendary. Crews gathered to watch Morton and O'Kane step off the gangway, sunburned and exhausted, their boat scarred but victorious. Photographers swarmed, headlines followed. O'Kane smiled for the camera, but inside he was uneasy. Fame was dangerous. Fame made you careless. That summer, as Wahoo prepared for another patrol, O'Kane received unexpected orders. He was to be reassigned to train on a new submarine, the USS Tang. Morton, proud but superstitious, told him, "Don't get too comfortable on land, Dick. The ocean remembers its own." He never saw Wahoo again. In October 1943, Wahoo disappeared while returning from a patrol in the Sea of Japan. No distress call, no debris, no survivors. The Navy listed her as missing in action. For O'Kane, the loss hit like a physical blow. He spent nights rereading his last log entries from the boat, hearing Morton's voice in the static of memory. "I learned everything I know from him," he said later, "but I also learned that the ocean takes back what it teaches." When he took command of USS Tang in 1944, he carried that lesson with him. He was not there to prove himself or to chase records. He was there to do the job, clean, precise, disciplined. The Hunter had found his own rhythm, and the Pacific was waiting. He had learned how to kill quietly, and how to survive it. When the Hunter became the captain, the ocean turned into his battlefield. In early 1944, Richard O'Kane took command of a brand new submarine, USS Tang. Sleek, powerful, and armed with the latest torpedoes, she was everything the US Navy had learned from 3 years of brutal trial and error. For O'Kane, it was more than a command. It was the chance to refine an art he had studied since the first days on Wahoo, the art of striking unseen. From the beginning, he set the tone. Tang would fight by discipline, not impulse. "No heroics," he told his crew. "We win by thinking faster than the enemy." The men soon understood why he had been chosen. Every patrol briefing was exact, every maneuver timed to seconds. He drilled them endlessly, crash dives, silent running, reload cycles, until the boat moved like a single, living thing. They respected his calm, some even feared it. The first patrol, west of Truck Lagoon, proved his method. On a moonless night, radar picked up a Japanese convoy. O'Kane surfaced within visual range, closing to less than 1,000 yards, suicidal distance by most standards. He waited, heart steady, counting silhouettes in the dark. When the moment came, he whispered, "Fire one." The torpedo struck, then another. Within minutes, the sea was lit by burning oil. "That," one sailor said, "was the quietest chaos I've ever seen." Reports from headquarters were almost incredulous. Tang sank 6 ships in her first patrol, the most successful debut in submarine history. O'Kane didn't celebrate. He simply filed the reports, noted torpedo performance, and prepared the crew for the next mission. Perfection, he reminded them, isn't luck twice. Each patrol pushed deeper into enemy waters, the Marianas, the Formosa Strait, the East China Sea. The farther they went, the more the ocean seemed to belong to Tang. O'Kane developed new tactics, night surface attacks using radar bearings, high-speed firing sequences, daring penetration of escort screens. He reduced the time between first sighting and strike to minutes. His crew called him the clockwork skipper. But the precision hid exhaustion. The psychological toll of submarine warfare was relentless. Days of silence broken by seconds of terror. The air thick with oil and sweat. Men counting the pings of enemy sonar like seconds of life. O'Kane never showed strain, but in his logbook he wrote, "Leadership is pretending you're not afraid so the others can breathe." By mid-1944, Tang had become the most lethal submarine in the Pacific Fleet. Her 5th patrol, in the Taiwan Strait, would seal both her reputation and her fate. O'Kane's orders were simple. Intercept Japanese reinforcements moving south toward the Philippines. What followed was a textbook demonstration of undersea warfare. On October 23rd, Tang sighted a heavily escorted convoy just before dawn. O'Kane ordered a surface attack, a decision that defied doctrine but suited his instincts. As the first torpedoes struck, chaos erupted. Explosions rolled across the water, searchlights swept the waves, Japanese guns fired blindly into the dark. O'Kane weaved between columns of fire, directing salvos with the calm of a man reading instruments in a lab. He sank 5 ships in 10 minutes. The ocean burned. His crew stared at him, stunned. "That's enough, Captain," the exec whispered. O'Kane nodded, almost absently. "One more," he said. He loaded the final 2 torpedoes, the last weapons aboard Tang. No one knew it yet, but one of those torpedoes was faulty. At 2:30 a.m., O'Kane fired the first. A hit. He fired the second, and saw, through the periscope, something that froze his blood. The weapon curved, its track arcing back toward them in a perfect half-circle. "Down scope!" he shouted. "Emergency dive!" Seconds later, the world shattered. A violent explosion tore through the stern. Lights died. The boat lurched, flooding fast. Out of 87 men, only 9 would ever see the surface again. O'Kane was thrown into the water, stunned, watching his ship vanish into a whirl of bubbles and flame. The machine he had mastered, trusted, and led beyond imagination had killed itself. He floated among debris until dawn, clinging to wreckage, listening to the cries of his crew fade one by one. The hunter of the Pacific was now adrift in the ruins of his own triumph. He had commanded the ocean, until the ocean reminded him that it never obeys. He fired the shot that ended the war for him. The sea was calm when the wreckage of USS Tang drifted apart under the pale light of dawn. Oil and debris spread like ink across the surface, carrying the last traces of a submarine that had once ruled those waters. Richard O'Kane clung to a piece of broken timber, half conscious, his ears ringing from the blast. Around him, voices called out through the haze, then one by one they stopped. He had survived torpedoes, depth charges, and storms, but this was different. This was silence, the silence of failure, of disbelief. The machine he had trusted like an extension of himself had turned on him, its final act a betrayal written in steel. Hours passed. The sun burned high. The oil film shimmered like glass. O'Kane's arm throbbed, his vision blurred. When he finally spotted the faint outlines of Japanese ships on the horizon, he knew rescue meant captivity. The Japanese destroyers moved through the wreckage slowly, their crews pointing and shouting. A few survivors were hauled aboard. O'Kane was among them, stripped, bound, and beaten before he could speak. For the first time in the war, the hunter was now the hunted. The Japanese interrogators wanted names, tactics, codes, anything. They accused him of atrocities, mocked the American claims of victory. O'Kane said little. He knew that every word could be twisted into propaganda. The blows came often, the food rarely. He was marched from one cell to another, hearing the screams of other prisoners through thin walls. He later described the captivity, not in terms of cruelty but of control. "In command," he said, "you master your fear. In prison it masters you." Weeks turned to months. The prisoners were moved north to Formosa, then to a camp near Tokyo. There, O'Kane met a handful of his surviving crew, gaunt, half-starved, but alive. They were shocked to see their captain standing in the same rags they wore. He spoke quietly, urging them to endure. "We made it through the depths," he said. "We can make it through this." They built a small world inside the camp, a network of whispered encouragement and stolen scraps of hope. O'Kane never spoke of revenge. He focused on order. He insisted they keep routine, cleaning their space, rationing food, helping the sick. To some it seemed obsessive. To him it was survival. "If you stop thinking like sailors," he said, "you stop being men." At night, when the guards were gone, he lay awake, replaying the last minutes of Tang. He could still see the curved wake of that final torpedo, the impossible arc of death returning. He asked himself whether it was fate, mistake, or simple mechanics. The question haunted him not as guilt but as a mystery. How could something so perfectly engineered fail so completely? In the spring of 1945, the bombings began. The sky over Tokyo burned red, and even the guards grew nervous. O'Kane and his men were herded into shelters, listening to the rumble of explosions above. For the first time, their captors looked frightened. "The war is ending," whispered one of the prisoners. O'Kane said nothing. He had learned that endings are never gentle. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the camp gates opened not with ceremony but confusion. American soldiers arrived within days, stunned by what they found. O'Kane, rail-thin and silent, saluted them weakly. He weighed barely 100 pounds. The rescuers offered him food, cigarettes, and congratulations. He accepted only water. Back aboard an American hospital ship, he stood on the deck and watched the coastline fade into mist. He didn't feel joy, only a strange, detached clarity. The war had given him everything and taken everything back. He thought of the 80 men who hadn't come home, their names carved now into memory. When reporters asked how he felt to have survived, he said, "Lucky." But luck isn't the same as deserving. For his leadership aboard Tang, the Navy would later award him the Medal of Honor. But medals, he knew, could not fill the silence left by those lost beneath the sea. He accepted the honor with a steady hand and eyes that looked past the cameras, as if still searching the horizon for a shape rising from the water. He had been the ocean's most disciplined predator. Now, freed from its depths, he carried the quiet of it inside him forever. He had faced the enemy above and below, but the hardest battle was the one fought within. The silent hunter became the survivor no one could understand. When Richard O'Kane stepped back onto American soil, the war had already turned into legend. Newspapers called him the greatest submarine commander of the Pacific, printing photographs of his lean face beneath bold headlines. But the man himself looked smaller than his reputation, gaunt, sunken-eyed, carrying the distant calm of someone who had lived too long underwater. In Washington, admirals and journalists awaited his words. They expected speeches about victory, vengeance, and valor. Instead, O'Kane spoke quietly. "The sea does not take sides. It only teaches." The room fell silent. For him, the end of the war was not triumph. It was balance restored. A long breath after years of holding it. The Medal of Honor ceremony was brief. O'Kane accepted it from President Truman with the same steady posture he had maintained in the conning tower. He saluted, thanked the crew of Tang, and walked away. There were no interviews afterward, no parades. He returned to the Pacific Fleet headquarters, where he resumed his duties in training and development. His reports were clinical, his tone detached. He seemed at home only among machinery and diagrams. Those who worked with him noticed that he avoided loud rooms. He flinched at sudden noises, preferred dim lights. When asked about the Tang, he would answer precisely, factually, without emotion. "The torpedo misfired," he would say. "We followed procedure. There was no warning." But at night, colleagues saw him staring at the harbour through his office window, watching ships slide silently into the dark. He remained in the Navy for another decade, helping design safer submarines and refine attack doctrines. His insistence on redundancy in torpedo safety systems saved countless lives in the years that followed. He never boasted, but engineers knew. Every line of his memos was written in remembrance of the men who had gone down with him. In 1957, he retired with the rank of captain. He was 46, still young, but tired in a way that no rest could mend. He and his wife Ernestine settled in California, near the coast. The sound of waves comforted him. He taught at the Naval Postgraduate School, lecturing on leadership and control. His students found him stern but fair. He didn't teach tactics, one recalled. He taught silence, how to think clearly when everyone else is shouting. At home, O'Kane kept few reminders of war. On his desk stood a single framed photograph of Tang's crew, 87 men, smiling in sunlight. Below it, a brass plate read, "They still patrol." He spoke of them rarely, but when he did, his voice softened. They were the best, he'd say simply, and they deserved better. In 1977, he published his memoir, Clear the Bridge, written in the same restrained, analytical tone that had defined his life. The book became a classic among naval historians, a blueprint of submarine warfare from the inside. But readers also sensed what he never stated outright: the loneliness of command, the guilt of survival, the strange intimacy between man and machine. "The captain lives with every order he gives," he wrote, some of them for the rest of his life. Retirement brought peace but never comfort. He maintained the habits of a commander, waking early, keeping notebooks, checking barometers. The ocean remained near, visible through his living room window. Sometimes neighbors saw him standing outside at dusk, facing west toward the horizon, motionless for minutes at a time. When old shipmates visited, they spoke little of war. Instead, they talked of grandchildren, of weather, of fishing. Yet always, before leaving, one would ask about Tang. O'Kane would nod once, as if to say he understood the question and the silence that followed it. She was the best, he would reply, and nothing more. In 1994, at the age of 83, Richard O'Kane died peacefully at his home in Petaluma, California. His ashes were scattered in the Pacific, the same ocean that had once been his battlefield, his prison, and his home. At Pearl Harbor, a simple plaque bears his name alongside his crew. It reads, "They gave their lives that others might learn." Below it, the faint sound of waves echoes through the submarine memorial, rhythmic, endless, like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. He mastered the depths, but never escaped them. In life and in memory, Richard O'Kane remained what he had always been, the silent hunter, listening still. He came back from the depths and spent his life teaching others never to forget what waits below. By the time Richard O'Kane passed away in 1994, submarine warfare had become the province of computers and sonar grids, of weapons fired by men who never saw their targets. Yet even in that age of automation, every submarine officer knew his name. His doctrines were printed in training manuals. His voice echoed in classrooms at Pearl Harbor and Groton. For a generation that had never heard the groan of a hull under depth charge, O'Kane remained the measure of what calm courage meant. He never sought legend, but legend found him. The Navy called him the most successful submarine commander of the Pacific War. 33 ships sunk, more than 100,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. To O'Kane, those numbers were meaningless. "We weren't counting," he said once. "We were surviving." That sentence became a motto carved above the Submarine Force Museum, an answer to those who confuse precision with glory. His book, Clear the Bridge, outlived him, studied by cadets for its logic and restraint. It described every decision, every calculation, with the detachment of a scientist dissecting his own heartbeat. Yet between the lines ran something more human, a quiet insistence that discipline was not the opposite of empathy, but its protector. Historians noted how rarely he used the word enemy. He spoke instead of targets, contacts, ships. To him, the ocean was neutral. The war was a human distortion passing through it. In 2000, a Los Angeles-class submarine was commissioned under his name, USS O'Kane, DDG-77. At the ceremony, old sailors stood beside young officers, and the Navy chaplain read from his writings. The sea is never conquered, it only lends itself to those who respect it. As the ship's horn sounded, veterans wept quietly. It was not pride they felt, but recognition, the sound of one era saluting another. Modern commanders cite O'Kane not for aggression but for composure. His ability to hold still amid panic, to think 3 moves ahead, became the model for crisis leadership far beyond the Navy. Business schools, astronauts, and even rescue divers quote his line, "Calm is contagious." Few knew he wrote it in the margins of a logbook during his captivity, when calm was the only thing left to share. To historians, he represents the paradox of 20th century warfare, the technician forced to face the moral weight of his own efficiency. He proved that mastery of the machine is not enough. One must master what the machine awakens inside. "War," he wrote late in life, "does not test men, it reveals them." His words are still read aloud to new officers at the submarine school's graduation ceremony. At Pearl Harbor's submarine memorial, his name appears twice, once with the Tang's crew on the Wall of Honor, and again on a small bronze plate beside Wahoo. Visitors sometimes ask why. The answer lies in what he once told a reporter. "Every patrol I ever made began with the ghosts of those who didn't come back. They guided me better than any compass." In museums, his artifacts remain simple. A slide rule, a periscope eyepiece, a coffee cup etched with the emblem of Tang. No medals, no portraits in gold. He would have preferred it that way. His legacy was never about the mythology of victory, but about responsibility. about men who lived and died inside narrow tubes of steel, carrying out the most invisible war on Earth. The last words of Clear the Bridge are often quoted, though few realize he meant them not as triumph but as warning. We cleared the bridge for action, but every action must someday be accounted for. That accounting became his quiet life's work, the teaching, the mentoring, the insistence on integrity long after the shooting stopped. The ocean keeps no monuments, yet somewhere beneath its surface, in the silence he once commanded, lies the memory of a man who mastered it not by force but by listening. He sank fleets, survived the abyss, and rose again to remind the world that the sea remembers everything.